everybody, it's Mrs. Callahan. I hope you are all doing super well. It is May, so it means that the weather's about to get warmer. I know that today was a super sunshiny day, even though it was a little bit chilly. It was nice to see the sunshine. I am ready for some warm days so we can spend some more time outside. I know my family and I, we like to spend some time in our backyard. I can't wait for us to open up our pool. I hope that you have some things that you're looking forward to. As always, if you want to share any of those things with me, or if you want to share any books you're reading, or if you just want to say hi, you can email me, okay? I am here today, though, for Artemis Fowl. It is time for Chapter 4. If you remember the last time we read, we sort of got away from Artemis's story a little bit, and we learned about a leprechaun named Holly. She was a fairy. I remember that she didn't do the ritual that she was supposed to do, so she was very low on her magic, right? And that got her into some trouble with one of the jobs that she was trying to do. She was trying to get that troll, and it didn't go so well. And I remember on the back, it mentions Captain Holly Short of the Leprechaun unit, and it says something about Artemis kidnapping her when he kidnaps a fairy. And Chapter 4 that we're about to read is called Abduction. So I'm kind of predicting in my mind that their stories, their paths, are about to cross. So let's see what happens. Chapter 4, Abduction. Artemis's main problem was one of location. How to locate a leprechaun. This was one sly bunch of fairies, hanging around for God knows how many millennia, and still not one photo, not one frame of video. Not even a Loch Ness type hoax. They weren't exactly a sociable group, and they were smart too. No one had ever gotten his hands on fairy gold, but no one had ever had access to the book either, and puzzles were so simple when you had the key. Artemis had summoned the butlers to his study, and spoke to them now from behind a mini lectern. There are certain rituals every fairy must complete to renew his magic, explained Artemis. Butler and Juliet nodded, as though this were a normal briefing. Artemis flicked through his hard copy of the book and selected a passage. From the earth thine power flows, given through courtesy, so thanks are owed. Pluck thou the magic seed, where full moon, ancient oak, and twisted water meet, and bury it far from where it was found, so return your gift into the ground. So I'm thinking this maybe has something to do with that ritual that Holly hadn't completed to refresh her magic, right? Artemis closed the text. Do you see? Butler and Juliet kept nodding, while still looking thoroughly mystified. Artemis sighed. The leprechaun is bound by certain rituals. Very specific rituals, I might add. We can use them to track one down. Juliet raised a hand, even though she herself was 4 years Artemis's senior. So she's older than Artemis, but she's still raising her hand to speak, is what they're saying. Yes? Well, the thing is, Artemis, she said hesitantly, twisting a strand of blonde hair in a way that several of the local Lotus considered extremely attractive. The bit about leprechauns. Artemis frowned. It was a bad sign. Your point, Juliet? Well, leprechauns, you know they're not real, don't you? Butler winced. It was his fault, really. He'd never got around to filling in his sister on the mission parameters. Artemis scowled reprovingly at him. Butler hasn't already talked to you about this? No, was he supposed to? Yes, he certainly was. Perhaps he thought you'd laugh at him. Butler squirmed. That was exactly what he'd thought. Juliet was the only person alive who laughed at him with embarrassing regularity. Most other people did it once. Just once. Remember, Butler's kind of a big, scary guy. Artemis cleared his throat. Let us proceed under the assumption that a fairy folk do exist, and that I am not a gibbering moron. Butler nodded weakly. Juliet was unconvinced. Very well. Now, as I was saying, the people have to fulfill a specific ritual to renew their powers. According to my interpretation, they must pick a seed from an ancient oak tree by the bend in a river, and they must do this during a full moon. The light began to dawn in Butler's eyes. So all we have to do is run a cross-reference through the weather satellites, which I already have. Believe it or not, there aren't that many ancient oaks left, if you take ancient to be 100-year plus. When you factor in the river bend and full moon, there are precisely 129 sites to be surveyed in this country. Butler grinned. Stakeout. Now the master was talking his language. There are preparations to be made for our guest's arrival, said Artemis, handing a typewritten sheet of A4 to Juliet. These alterations must be made to the cellar. See to it, Juliet. To the letter. Yes, Artie. Artemis frowned, but only slightly. For reasons that he couldn't quite fathom, he didn't mind terribly when Juliet called him by the pet name his mother had for him. Butler scratched his thin chin thoughtfully. Artemis noticed the gesture. Question? Well, Artemis, the sprite in Ho Chi Minh City. Remember, this was the fairy that they tricked the book from. Artemis nodded. I know. Why didn't we simply abduct her, right? Yes, sir. According to Chi Lun's Almanac of the People, a 7th century manuscript recovered from the lost city of Shishamo. Once a fairy has taken spirits with the mud people. That's us, by the way. Oh, we were right. The mud people are us, humans. They are forever dead to their brothers and sisters. So there was no guarantee that that particular fairy was worth even 1 ounce of gold. No, my old friend. We need fresh blood. All clear? Butler nodded. Good. Now there are several items you will need to procure for our moonlight jaunts. Butler scanned the sheet. Basic field equipment. A few eyebrow razors. But nothing too puzzling until... Sunglasses? At night? When Artemis smiled, as he did now, one almost expected vampire fangs to sprout from his gums. Yes, Butler. Sunglasses. Trust me. And Butler did, implicitly. Holly activated the thermal coil in her suit and climbed to 13,000 feet. The hummingbird wings were top of the range. The battery readout showed 4 red bars, more than enough for a quick jaunt through mainland Europe and across the British Isles. So remember, she had to go do her ritual, right? Her boss gave her very specific instructions. Of course, the regulations said always travel over water if possible, but Holly could never resist knocking the snowcap from the highest Alp on her way past. The suit protected Holly from the worst of the elements, but she could still feel the chill sinking into her bones. The moon seemed huge from this altitude, the craters on its surface easily distinguishable. Tonight it was a perfect sphere, a magical full moon. Immigration would have their hands full, as thousands of surface-sick ferries were drawn irresistibly overground. A large percentage would make it, probably causing mayhem in their revelry. Earth's mantle was riddled with illegal tunnels, and it was impossible to police them all. Holly followed the Italian coast up to Monaco, and from there across the Alps to France. She loved flying. All fairies did. According to the book, they had once been equipped with wings of their own, but evolution had stripped them of this power. All but the sprites. One school of thought believed that the people were descendant from airborne dinosaurs, possibly pterodactyls. Much of the upper body skeletal structure was the same. This theory would certainly explain the tiny nub of bone on each shoulder blade. Holly toyed with the idea of visiting Disneyland Paris. The LEP had several undercover operatives stationed there, most of them working in the Snow White exhibit. Think about that. Leprechauns, would she say she's about 3 feet tall? Snow White and the 7 dwarves. It was one of the few places on Earth where the people could pass unnoticed. But if some tourist got a photo of her and it ended up on the internet, Root would have her badge for sure. With a sigh of regret, she passed over the shower of multicolored fireworks below. Once across the channel, Holly flew low, skipping over the white-crested waves. She called out to the dolphins and they rose to the surface, leaping from the water to match her pace. She could see the pollution in them, bleaching their skin white and giving them red sores on their backs. And although she smiled, her heart was breaking. Mud people had a lot to answer for. Finally, the coast loomed ahead of her, the old country, the land where time began, the most magical place on the planet. It was here, 10,000 years ago, that the ancient fairy race, the Daidanan, had battled against the demon Fomorians, carving the famous Giant's Causeway with the strengths of their magical blasts. It was here that the Lea Fowl stood, the rock at the center of the universe, where the fairy kings and later the human Ard Ri were crowned. And it was also here, unfortunately, that the mud people were most in tune with magic, which resulted in a far higher people sighting rate than you got anywhere else on the planet. Thankfully, the rest of the world assumed that the Irish were crazy, a theory that the Irish themselves did nothing to debunk. They had somehow gotten it into their heads that each fairy lugged around a pot of gold with him wherever he went. While it was true that Lep had a ransom fund, because of its officer's high-risk occupation, no human had ever taken a chunk of it yet. This didn't stop the Irish population in general from skulking around rainbows, hoping to win the supernatural lottery. So think about, especially around St. Patrick's Day, we always think about leprechauns, and we think about them being Irish, and we think about them having a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, right? So this is almost sort of like explaining where that superstition or where that story came from. But in spite of it all, there was one race the people felt an affinity for. It was the Irish. Perhaps it was their eccentricity, perhaps their dedication to the Craich, as they called it. And if the people were actually related to humans, as another theory had it, odds are that the Emerald Isle was where it started. Holly punched up a map on her wrist locator and set it to sweep for magical hot spots. The best site would obviously be Tara, near the Lia Fowl, but on a night like this, every traditionalist fairy with an overgrown past would be dancing around the holy scene, so best to give it a miss. There was a secondary site not far from here, just off the southeast coast. Easy access from the air, but remote and desolate for land-bound humans. Holly reined in the throttle and descended to 90 yards. She skipped over a bristling evergreen forest, emerging in a moonlit meadow. A silver thread of river bisected the field, and there, nestling in the fold of the meander loop, was the proud oak. Holly checked her locator for life forms. Once she judged the cow 2 fields over to not be a threat, she cut her engines and glided to the foot of the mighty oak tree. So I'm kind of making a prediction here. Holly is headed out to do her ritual, and Artemis knows about this ritual and knows kind of where it takes place. I think maybe their paths are about to cross. I don't know. What do you think? Let's see here. Only a couple pages left in the chapter. Let's see what happens. 4 months of stakeout. Even Butler, the consummate professional, was beginning to dread the long nights of dampness and insect bites. Thankfully, the moon was not full every night, so they've been doing this for 4 months now. We're kind of seeing what they've been up to. It was always the same. They would crouch in their foil-lined blind in complete silence, Butler repeatedly checking his equipment, while Artemis stared unblinking through the eye of the scope. At times like these, nature seemed deafening in their confined space. Butler longed to whistle, to make conversation, anything to break the unnatural silence. But Artemis's concentration was absolute. He would brook no interference or lapse of focus. This was business. Tonight they were in the southeast, the most inaccessible site yet. Butler had been forced to make 3 trips in the jeep in order to hump the equipment across a stile, a bog, and 2 fields. His boots and trousers were ruined. And now he would have to sit in the blind with ditch water soaking into the seat of his pants. Artemis had somehow contrived to remain spotless. The blind was ingenious in design, and interest had already been expressed in the manufacturing rights, mostly by military representatives, but Artemis had resolved to sell the patent to a sporting goods multinational. It was constructed of an elasticated foil polymer of multi-hinged fiberglass skeleton. The foil, similar to that used by NASA, trapped the heat inside the structure while preventing the camouflaged outside surface from overheating. This ensured that any animals sensitive to heat would be unaware of its presence. The hinges meant that the blind would move almost like liquid, filling whatever depression it was dropped into. Instant shelter and vantage point. You simply placed the Velcroed bag in a hole and pulled the string. So the blind is what they're hiding in. We remember when we just saw Holly choosing her spot, she was sort of searching the area, and she could tell that there was a cow 2 fields over, but she judged that it wasn't anything dangerous. So I'm guessing Artemis is close to her, but she doesn't know because of this contraption that he's invented. But all the cleverness in the world couldn't improve the atmosphere. Something was troubling Artemis. It was plain in the web of premature lines that spread from the corners of his deep blue eyes. After several nights of fruitless surveillance, Butler plucked up enough courage to ask. "Artemis," he began hesitantly, I realize it's not my place, but I know there's something wrong, and if there's anything I can do to help. Artemis didn't speak for several moments, and for those few moments, Butler saw the face of a young boy, the boy Artemis might have been. "It's my mother, Butler," he said at last. "I'm beginning to wonder if she'll ever—" Then the proximity alarm flashed red. So he was about to reveal something pretty deep, I think. We haven't seen much emotion from Artemis, just sort of this greed and this determination. But then all of a sudden the proximity alarm flashed red. Holly hooked the wings over a low branch, unstrapping the helmet to give her ears some air. You had to be careful with elfin ears. A few hours in the helmet and they started to flake. She gave the tips a massage. No dry skin there. That was because she had a daily moisturizing regime. Not like some of the male LEP officers. When they took off their helmets, you'd swear it just started to snow. Holly paused for a minute to admire the view. Ireland certainly was picturesque. Not even the mud people hadn't been able to destroy that. Not yet, anyway. Give them another century or two. So I'm guessing their view of us, everything we've heard, they don't really respect or think that humans are good people, huh? The river was folding gently before her like a silver snake, hissing as the water tumbled across a stony bed. The oak tree crackled overhead, its branches rasping together in the bracing breeze. Wow, I can really picture that if I close my eyes. They used a lot of descriptive, a lot of vivid imagery. Now to work. She could do the tourist thing all night once her business was complete. A seed. She needed a seed. Holly bent to the ground, brushing the dried leaves and twigs from the clay's surface. Her fingers closed around a smooth acorn. That wasn't hard now, was it? She thought. All that remained for her to do was plant it somewhere, and her powers would come rushing back. Butler checked the porter radar, muting the volume in case the equipment betrayed their position. The red alarm swept the screen with agonizing lethargy, and then flash! An upright figure by a tree. Too small for an adult. The wrong proportions for a child. He gave Artemis the thumbs up, a possible match. Artemis nodded, strapping the mirrored sunglasses across his brow. Butler followed his leads, popping the cap on his weapon's starlight scope. This was no ordinary dart rifle. It had been specifically tooled for a Kenyan ivory hunter and had the range and rapid-fire capacity of a Kalashnikov. Butler had picked it up for a song from a government official after the ivory poacher's execution. They crept into the night with practiced silence. The diminutive figure before them unhooked a contraption from around its shoulders and lifted a full-face helmet from a definitely non-human head. Butler wrapped the rifle strap twice around his wrist, pulling the stock onto his shoulder. He activated the scope, and a red dot appeared in the center of the figure's back. Artemis nodded, and his manservant squeezed the trigger. In spite of the 1,000,000-to-1 odds, it was at that precise moment that the figure bent low to the earth. So I'm guessing the figure's Holly, right? They're finally crossing paths, and Butler is trying to shoot it with some sort of dart, it seems. Something whizzed over Holly's head. Something glinted in the starlight. Holly had enough on-the-job experience to realize that she was under fire, and immediately curled her elfin frame into a ball, minimizing the target. She drew her pistol, rolling toward the shelter of the tree trunk. Her brain scrambled for possibilities. Who could be shooting at her? And why? Something was waiting beside the tree. Something roughly the size of a mountain, but considerably more mobile. Nice pea shooter, grinned the figure, smothering Holly's gun hand in a turnip-sized fist. Holly managed to extricate her fingers in a nanosecond before they snapped like brittle spaghetti. "I don't suppose you would consider a peaceful surrender," said a cool voice behind her. Holly turned, elbows raised for combat. "No," sighed the boy melodramatically. "I suppose not." Holly put on her best brave face. "Stay back, human. You don't know what you're dealing with." The boy laughed. "I believe, Fairy, that you are the one unfamiliar with the facts." Fairy? He knew she was a fairy. "I have magic, mudworm, enough to turn you and your gorilla into pig droppings." The boy took a step closer. "Brave words, miss, but lies nonetheless. If, as you say, you had magic, you would have no doubt used it by now. No, I suspect that you have gone too long without the ritual, and you are here to replenish your powers." Holly was dumbfounded. There was a human before her, casually spouting sacred secrets. This was disastrous, catastrophic. It could mean the end of generations of peace. If the humans were aware of fairy subculture, it was only a matter of time before the two species went to war. She must do something. There was only one weapon left in her arsenal. The mesmer is the lowest form of magic and requires only a trickle of power. There are even certain humans with a bent for their talent. It is within the ability of even the most drained fairy to put a complete mind kibosh on any human alive. Holly summoned the final dribble of magic from the base of her skull. "Human," she intoned, her voice suddenly resonating with bass tones. "Your will is mine." Artemis smiled, safely behind his mirrored lenses. "I doubt it," he said, and nodded curtly. Holly felt the dart puncture the suit's tough material, depositing its load of curare and succinylcholine, chloride-based tranquilizer into her shoulder. So a tranquilizer just makes you like sleepy, makes you kind of pass out. The world instantly dissolved into a series of technicolored bubbles, and, try as she might, Holly couldn't seem to hold on to more than one thought. And that thought was, how did they know? It spiraled around her head as she sank into unconsciousness. How did they know? How did they know? How did they? Artemis saw the pain in the creature's eyes as the hollow hypodermic plunged into her body, and for a moment he experienced misgivings. It means he kind of feels regretful. A female. He hadn't expected that. A female like Juliet or his mother. Then the moment passed and he was himself again. So we've seen kind of two moments of emotion from him here, huh? "Good shooting," he said, bending to study their prisoner. "Definitely a girl. Pretty, too, in a pointy sort of way." "Sir?" Butler was pointing to the creature's helmet. It was half buried in a drift of leaves where the fairy had dropped it. A buzzing noise was coming from the crown. Artemis picked up the contraption by the straps, searching for the source. "Ah, here we are." He plucked the view cam from its slot, careful to point the lens away from Butler. "Fairy technology. Most impressive," he muttered, popping the battery from its groove. The camera whined and died. "Nuclear power source, if I'm not mistaken. We must be careful not to underestimate our opponents." Butler nodded, sliding their captive into an oversized duffel bag. Something else to be lugged across the two fields. A bog and a stile. And that's the end of the chapter. Chapter 5 is called Missing in Action. So Artemis has kidnapped Holly. What do we think is going to happen? Do you have any predictions? If you want to email them to me, I would love to hear your predictions, hear what you think might happen to Artemis or to Holly, or where our story might go from here. I'll chat. I'm always happy to hear from any of you. I miss you all very much. I hope that you are finding ways to keep busy, finding ways to keep smiling. That's the most important thing. I hope you're finding time to get outside now that the weather's getting nicer. And I just hope you're happy. I hope your families are well. And I hope you tune in to find out what happens in Chapter 5. Keep your eye out on our YouTube channel, and I'll post it in a couple days, okay? Until then, I miss you much. I can't wait to see you all again soon. Bye, everybody.